Hello and welcome to our Moxy webinar titled Using Moxy for Return to Play Training After Injury, presented by Aaron Davis of Train, Adapt, Evolve. Before we get started, we have a couple of announcements. Our next webinar will be on using Moxy for hockey training and will be presented by Arnaud Galmarini of Elite Training. Elite Training had several athletes in the recent Winter Olympics, so this should be some more great information. I've pasted a registration link in the chat section if you want to get registered for that next webinar. This second announcement is we will be hosting a hockey training symposium in Minneapolis on April 14th. Participants will include Brian Kozak from Next Level Sport Preparation, Cal Dietz from the University of Minnesota, and Juan Gonzalez from GVN Performance. If you're interested in attending that, please email rich@moxymonitor.com for more information. It's just rich@moxymonitor.com, and he will get you more information on that. Also, Train, Adapt, Evolve is hosting a seminar on April 6, 7, and 8 in Austin. And I have pasted a link in the chat if you're interested in signing up for their seminar. So our format for today is our typical webinar format. Aaron is going to present for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll take a short question break about halfway through, and we'll have a longer Q&A break at the end. So if you have questions, just type them into the question box as you have them. That's on the right side of your screen, and then we'll take those during the question breaks. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Aaron, and he can get started with the webinar.
All right. Hello, guys. I am Aaron Davis. Sorry, I'm trying to get some stuff out of my way here. Think here. All right, so we're going to talk about return to play, or at least how we go about our process. And probably for you guys, you will probably see some things that might be a little bit different than maybe what you've seen before. Just our thought process behind things tends to be maybe a little bit outside the box. So we'll kind of get into it a little bit here, I think. So how this is pretty much going to run, we're going to look kind of like an overview, kind of solely my thoughts, kind of this inside out, looking at structure and function and how we look at, getting athletes back on the field or in their respective sport. And then we're also going to look at a case study, specifically a football player, running back, who's had hamstring injuries chronically for, close to 10 plus years. So let's first look at my thoughts on this. So at the end of the day, we're looking at structure and function. I believe this is kind of how nature maybe intended it. We have a certain structure that dictates a function. Now, on top of that, if we just look at what does damaged tissue look like, okay? We can see to the left that we have a little bit more frayed tissue in the muscle, and then on the control side, good healthy tissue looks pristine, all right? So when we see this structure, what does this mean from the functional side? So for us, this is going to be a really weird thing, but they just come out with this study, and it is ATP is a biological hydrotrope. So what does this mean? This means that ATP can obviously unfold proteins and separate proteins. It keeps muscle in a ready state and a stable state. This is probably no more important than when we start looking at how our muscles are now. We're nice and relaxed. When we die, rigor sets in, all right? Specifically when ATP dissipates. So how can this enlighten us a little bit on how the structure of a muscle cell, or just structure of cells in general, look? So when we look at the structure of a cell, in a normal tissue, we can have ATP binds. It's going to unfold a protein. When that unfolded protein is in its ready state, we're going to have PCR come down, and PCR ends up being one of the kind of the anionic molecules in the cell, and it's going to give a negative charge, and that ability is also going to bring in and probably house that potassium, and it's going to exclude sodium. So you're going to see this in a normal functioning cell. This is what this looks like when we have health or before we do any kind of work or any damage to the cell. So what does the damaged cell look like? Proteins are frayed. ATP might bind, but it's going to unfold only specific sites. It's not going to have I would say the conformational kind of phase transition of the whole protein. It's only going to be in that short protein. And when this happens, and we've either used a lot of PCR, both doing work or endangered or damaged cells, we're now going to have that potassium and sodium gradient is going to be changed. You're going to have sodium leaking in and potassium leaking out. Okay. They see this a lot when we look at, I think Bangsbo has this in one of his articles on muscle fatigue, but we see this happening and can be measured, right? When we see membrane excitability decreasing, and then also we see sodium in, potassium out. And now, why is this important? Well, when we look at Moxy and we're looking at how O2 is utilized, this is obviously going to affect mitochondria. So mitochondria live in that potassium-rich environment. When we don't have that environment, mitochondria might not be able to function like it needs to, specifically using O2 to deposit kind of those used electrons. So this is probably the reason why when we see either after maybe specific injury where we see SMO2 not being utilized very well, or when we have hard workouts and though the day before they utilize great, but then the day after we're seeing that SMO2 is not being utilized at all. It's our idea is that it's the structure is not right, the environment is not right for SMO2 or for O2 to be utilized. So early trends. What are we going to see with Moxy? Okay. Well, early on, we're probably going to see low SMO2. Why? Because the storage and utilization, well, mostly just the storage of O2 for the mitochondria are going to be lower. The damaged tissue is first probably going to knock out the ability of the mitochondria. You're also going to see that limited utilization of the O2 as well. Also on top of that, we're going to see altered recruitment, okay? Because of damaged tissue, when the brain is trying to coordinate movement, it's going to sub-recruit other muscles to try to figure out that movement strategy. And because of that, you're going to see probably a decrease in THB, okay? Just because from unused, right? And probably some of the biggest things we see this in is ACL injuries or knee injuries, right? Where the vastus medialis is atrophied, and when we start looking at the Moxy side of things, we're seeing this picture being presented. Now, from the late phase or the rehab phase, when we get them, right, it is now how can we increase repair? Okay, so repair first comes in. How can we build roads into the muscle to supply the muscle of obviously oxygen, but other nutrients to rebuild? Now, this can be good and bad. So in the initial phase of the rehab process or bringing an athlete back into function, you can accidentally overload the system too much. And when we see that and we overload too much, again, in that rehab process, you might actually see low SMO2 and then THB might increase quite a bit. This is a reaction that maybe the day before load was too much, okay? And so a lot of times when we're doing things, specifically, rehabbing or bringing an athlete back, we're always having the Moxy in session to see how they're utilizing and making sure that we're not doing too much on just one day. We're trying to spread out that workload and hit more frequency in low bounce than big bouts once or twice a week. But initially, we want to see an increase in THB to, like I said, to support the muscle. Then again, we also, with that, we want to see the mitochondria density improve. So you should see an increase in SMO2. And then depending on the sport, and we'll talk about that soon, we definitely want to see an increase in utilization, okay? So, specificity. So a lot of times when we talk about using the Moxy, people say, okay, well, we want great utilization every time for all athletes. Or, you know, we want high load of SMO2. And I think as coaches, we always want to try to have these absolutes. But in reality, you know, I think we can't really, successful coaches, in my estimation, can never really live in absolutes. We're always trying to find how can we adjust the environment, the physiological environment for the athlete to prepare them for their sport, so that injury, again, doesn't occur again. So we need to think about this when we look at preparing athletes for their prospective sport. A marathon runner, obviously, we're going to try to increase blood flow, and we want good O2 storage, right? Now, should they all be, you know, shot utilizers in the sense they all just utilize all the way down to 0%? Maybe not necessarily. Maybe they can hold a hard pace, steady, more longer, great delivery, and that's what we have to get them prepared for. Where on the opposite end of that, most field sports, specifically hockey here, when you know, in this slide, you want to be good at utilizing. Again, we want to have good blood flow, but utilization is probably key. So the big idea with this is make sure that you are specific in your preparation, okay? Just not one size fits all. So we'll kind of dive into this case study. And I know that there's probably going to be tons of questions on a lot of the stuff I already talked about on beforehand, but the idea of looking at this is how can we keep it as simple as possible, even though some of this stuff is kind of complex. So the best way we probably can show you is, you know, in this case study, and a lot of this is going to dictate on movement and how we use it from a movement perspective, and also from a therapeutic and being more accurate or precise on our interventions with our athletes. So on this case study, we have a running back. He is trying to get in with the Dallas Cowboys. He's had chronic hamstring injuries and has been everywhere known to man in America to try to fix it. He's had these for about 10 years, and he somehow stumbled across us, and we were lucky to get him when he was, you know, 8 pounds out of shape and out of shape, and it's been kind of a journey to get him back. But he just actually, right before he came with to us 2 weeks prior, he had a grade 2 hamstring strain. So we'll just kind of use him as our case study. My business partner, Patrick Estes, is kind of our movement specialist, and how we really look at movement or the body, and specifically trying to help these athletes with more efficient movement, is we want to, kind of stealing his words, but we want to try to, you know, create change in a position to increase availability of triplane motion, so that tissues don't get loaded or overloaded in, you know, certain phases of movement, and therefore it can increase biomechanical efficiency. So what does this mean? I think sometimes when we look at movement, we, even something as simple as running forward, though it's dominated in the sagittal plane, joints are going to be moving in 3D. In other words, they're going to be moving in the sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane. If an athlete is limited in a specific joint or is already pre-positioned in a specific way, then it might call upon tissue to be utilized in a way that might not end up being healthy in the long run. And we also maybe have to look at how the muscle action in general and these kind of general classifications and how it might not necessarily be always 100% true. We always think that when, you know, in running, when we're in stance phase with the opposite knee up, that opposite knee underneath that hamstring might be preloaded and isometric, right? Ready for that impact in stance. Now, we have to realize that muscles, tendons, the brain, it's always trying to figure out this movement strategy, and that the isometric, concentric, and eccentric actions might be happening very quickly and shades of each other through the different joint positions. So at times it's nice to talk about these things in isolation, but in reality, all this is happening all at once. So a lot of times in our day-to-day, we're always monitoring structure, right? We both have learned a lot from a mentor that's an osteopath, and so every day athletes come in, we have them on the table, and we're just going to do simple tests before their warm-up to see what the pre-position is of certain joints. Now, for this specific football player, he has like most sprinters, you will see kind of an anterior, or football players, specifically skill positions, you will see kind of an anterior tilt of the pelvis. This anterior tilt of the pelvis, he has to a great degree. And he also has an externally rotated femur and an externally rotated tibia. This ends up decreasing the variability for his brain to organize movement. His brain still does it, and he can get away with it, but once we start getting him stronger or faster and more velocities, all of a sudden the cracks start to show a little bit. And bicep femoris for him has been something that he's chronically injured, and once we start looking at the Moxy, you can kind of see why. It's a tissue that is overloaded, and it's mostly because of the pre-position of the joints, and then obviously the intramuscular coordination. So we'll take a look here. So we'll kind of classify this as function. Now, on the right hamstring, we'll just kind of put these lines up for you so we can kind of see the top and bottom of SMO2. The right hamstring, you can see, compression, obviously utilization. He utilizes down to about 30%, starts around 71, 72-ish. That's the right hamstring. That's the one that we would call, hasn't had any injuries, healthy, utilizing well. The left hamstring on the other side, we have slight compression into, probably at the very end, we start having, or even midway through, we start having an occlusion. And because of this, on the left hamstring and the position of the left hamstring, the specific joint position, we're going to see increased utilization, right? And what's interesting with this is that the first day we did this, and not just when we were testing, and when we tested here, this is actually testing a specific drill we use, which is a dribble drill, very low velocity and low range of motion, or range of motion through the joints. Very simple thing to do, and always the same distance, and we just have them walk back. So we just kind of are always testing. And what's interesting when we do this, and we even see people go through our standard warm-up, specifically with him, we started seeing that it took him longer in between each drill because he was utilizing so much more on the left hamstring. So when we think of him just doing that in the warm-up, and we have real no idea of this, if we just kind of not monitoring at all, then he could probably be at a very low basement level of SMO2 even before we start the actual sprinting or training or weightlifting, if that's the session. And we've already put him in a metabolic place where that tissue is not going to be supported. And so our idea with this is how can we then intervene, change joint position if needed, and allow the brain a little bit more variability to increase efficiency. So to be honest, we spent probably about an hour and a half playing in this specific case to see, can we get things to look similar to the right hamstring? So it took us about an hour and a half of just kind of doing different things, warming up specifically, and then testing it out. And we can kind of see that we get a compression on the left hamstring and utilization is less. So overall, this can give us the ability to, one, support the hamstring, less loading is going into that tissue, and therefore we can actually maybe do a warm-up and not really worry about, by the time the exercise hits or the training actually hits, that we're going to be in a deficit or a very low position metabolically for that tissue to kind of survive the workout. So that is a very, very, very quick presentation. I wanted to try to keep it quick, just to try to talk about some of the complicated stuff. I'm sure you guys will have questions, and yeah, I'll take those right now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Aaron, for presenting that. Just a reminder, if you'd like to get your questions in, just type them into the questions box on the right side of the screen. So we've got a few here. How big of a difference in SMO2 do you consider to be significant for left-right asymmetry?
Say that again.
So how big of a difference in SMO2 do you consider to be significant for a left-right asymmetry?
It's probably going to depend. I think, for me, there's probably always a little 10% rule just empirically in my head, generally. But, we want to see how the function obviously is going. So in other words, we might see when we first tested him, when he came in, we were looking at probably an SMO2 value, believe it was somewhere around like 69 on the left, and then on the right, he was sitting right about, 75 or 80 that day. And then when it came to utilization, not great utilization on that side because it just got injured. And then obviously when we got him up, we started seeing huge utilization and really none on the right. And so it's probably a little bit of both on that.
Okay. The next one here, does this type of cell damage occur also in delayed onset muscle soreness?
I think it's an explanation for sure.
Okay.
Just to a less degree. Obviously than an injury, but I think this is kind of what we're probably seeing with DOMs, or at least it could be a mechanism for DOMs.
Okay, just a second here. I gotta. Okay, this question is, after blood flow, is quite a bit, blood flow is quite a bit lower after. Why is that? And then apparently on the left, they clarified on the left. So blood flow on the left is quite a bit lower after. Why is that?
I'm guessing blood flow is probably a little bit lower on the left is because that came right off the table. And so we ended up doing an intervention on the table where he was resting, and then we popped back up, and that was actually his third or fourth go. But, obviously from a delivery standpoint, from the cardiac side, he probably cooled down a little bit, and then we came back and did that run.
Okay. All right. The next question here. What are the symptoms of SMO2 not being utilized compared to an increase in supply?
Well, so in other words, the mechanism or the?
Well, they're asking for the symptoms. What do you see?
What do I see from decreased utilization?
Yep.
Well, decreased utilization, when you have athletes, we're lucky to see athletes pretty much every day. And so when we do get these chances to see maybe decreased utilization, but yet if we push the athlete, or if we have other coaches that we are help monitoring their athletes and they push the athlete with low SMO2, you might see low SMO2, but you're going to see coordination change. It's easy with sprinters. It might be a little bit harder with field athletes, but when we see sprinters, you can just tell that something's off generally, right? And you can see that probably the brain is going to do, or is probably going to make different decisions when it comes to solving this kind of movement puzzle. And when you get them back on the table the next day, generally those are the times where you're like, man, this looks like you just got messed up, right? Like not messed up in a bad way, but just the fact that there's might be a little bit more tone systemically on the muscles. There's might be maybe pre-position that day might be a little bit off. Just because we're putting forces maybe in an incorrect way.
Okay. The next question, how do you define O2 storage?
So for us, specifically, we always kind of warm up, even him, even though he's like specifically a sprinter and stuff, we actually have him on a spin bike, and what we want to end up doing is kind of do the same thing every day, right? The therapy in the beginning might look different, but the warm-up is always the same to a certain point. And we just want to see what that day looks like from once we get them all warmed up, deliveries up there, initiated, respiratories initiated, and then we want to see what does storage look like. And generally, for somebody like him who is in kind of a speed and power and skill sport, I might not be looking at storage per se, but for some of my distance runners, I'm looking at it in the sense of like, how can we get obviously myoglobin, mitochondrial density, so that O2 in the cell is going to be readily available, and hopefully over through training cycles we can complete this. But I think the big thing on judging that is making sure that you're always doing at least the beginnings of your warm-up and everything else always the same.
Okay. All right, great. Well, that's the end of the questions that are typed in. Big thank you to Aaron for presenting this information. Great information. We really appreciate that. Just a reminder, the link to the seminar at Train, Adapt, Evolve is in the chat box if you want to check that out. And thanks to all of our attendees for attending. We will post the recording of this online. It'll be on the Moxy website. If you go to the training tab and the webinar section, we'll have the recording posted in about a day or so. So if you want to review any of this information again later, you can. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.